Welcome back. You're watching NewsX and I'm Shivani Singh. In a swift and decisive response to one of the nation's most devastating incidents in nearly 3 decades, the Australian government has unveiled plans for its largest gun buyback scheme since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced the initiative, emphasizing the need to remove hundreds of thousands of firearms from circulation amid national grief over a terrorist attack that claimed 15 lives at Sydney's iconic Bondi Beach. The tragedy unfolded on December 14, 2025 during a vibrant Hanukkah celebration, which was named Chanukah by the sea. It was organized by the local Shabbat Jewish community in Archer Park, adjacent to the Bondi Beach. Around 1,000 people had gathered for the festive event, marking the first night of the Jewish Festival of Lights, when 2 gunmen, identified as father and son Sajid Akram and Navid Akram, opened fire. The attackers, armed with legally owned firearms, including rifles and shotguns, targeted the crowd in what authorities have described as an anti-Semitic terrorist attack inspired by the Islamic State ideology. Let's in fact take a look at what the Australian gun laws are. And this change has been brought about in a very swift and decisive move by the Australian government. So what are the Australian gun laws? The National Firearms Agreement forms the basis of Australia's gun law. So the National Firearms Agreement is forming the basis of the gun law. The gun ownership is a privilege. It is not a constitutional right. So that's the basis, that it is not a privilege to own a gun. It is not a constitutional right. All firearms must be individually licensed and registered. So if you have multiple firearms, all have to be individually licensed. Self-defense is not a valid reason for gun ownership. So giving the reason of self-defense is not valid for gun ownership. They also must prove genuine reason, example hunting or sport, and pass strict checks. So there will be strict checks if you want a gun license, and you must have a valid reason. Applicants must pass background checks, safety training, and a 28-day waiting period. So there is a 28-day waiting period. You have to pass the strict background checks, and you have to make sure that you undergo a training as well. Semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns have been banned for civilians. So semi-automatic rifles and pump-action guns have now been banned for civilians. Mandatory buybacks in 1996 and the new 2025 scheme removed millions of guns. So in 1996 also there was a massacre, after which a buyback scheme was introduced, and this is the second one that we are seeing. There have been limits on the number of guns per person. 2025 reforms include citizenship requirements. So the 2025 change is that you need to be a citizen of Australia in order to apply for a gun license. Strict safe storage, waiting periods, and regular license reviews. So apart from all of this, there will be a regular, in fact, review of the license that you have. So clearly this is something that's very important and that the government is looking at. To take this discussion forward, I'm joined by Major General Gigi Dwivedi, Global and Strategic Defense Expert. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the broadcast. We appreciate your time. So when we are looking at this entire buyback scheme, this was something that had been implemented by the Australian government even in 1996 when there was a massacre. But 2025 seems to be very different from that buyback scheme, because here the government is imposing a limit on the number of firearms an individual licensed person can actually have. Earlier there was no such law to actually limit the number of firearms you have. And we saw that in that Bondi Beach terror attack, a single individual had up to 6 firearms registered and licensed to him, sir.
Firstly, Shivani, always a pleasure to be on the NewsX. Well, this is a very sensitive topic because of the latest horrendous and horrific instance that took place last week. And definitely it has shaken up the Australian government, Australian citizens. And therefore it warrants a absolute relook at not only the gun laws, but also the background checks, why the guns are required, and how couple of people get radicalized. So I think this requires a very holistic approach. And you very correctly brought out the gun laws which are already in place, and I think they are quite stringent because they requires background checks, require a reason to have the gun laws. Now they one has to be a citizen also, and of course, number of guns is one of the issues because Sergeant Akram had six firearms, and that means that there was no check on to how many firearms you can have. But today, unfortunately, like in 1996, when the instance took place, there was a consensus among all the parties that this new gun laws need to be implemented, and also the buyback of guns was one of the measures taken to ensure that such instances don't take place. But today the parties have a different approach. Like the right-wing populists, they are not for more stringent gun laws. Even the conservatives, they say that focus should be on the anti-Semitism rather than the gun laws. So the pointed issue is that today there is no consensus on making the gun laws more stringent. I think this is one of the political challenge for the Albanese government, while it has a overwhelming support in the parliament. But the point is, I think as a nation, there is a certain amount of angst against the present dispensation, and therefore this issue needs to be handled more deliberately in entirety, taking number of factors. Gun laws were one, then the background checks, and incidentally, Shivani, it is matter of surprise that from Australia, the ISIS has had a long shadow, and incidentally, more than 230 Australians went to Middle East to fight for ISIS. So the point I'm trying to make is the gun laws is one dimension, but this whole issue needs to be tackled from multiple dimensions. Shivani.
Absolutely. Sir, I would request you to in fact stay on with us as I introduce this piece of information to our viewers. Ahmad Al-Ahmad, the 43-year-old man who tackled the Bondi Beach shooter and saved many lives in the deadly shooting last week, was given a $2.5 million check in community donations. Ahmad, who is currently undergoing treatment for the injuries that he sustained in the horrific shootout, received the check from his hospital bed. So he's currently still undergoing treatment over there. If I can go back to Major General G.G. Dwivedi on this debate. So when we're looking at, you have rightly pointed out that these gun laws and this buyback scheme is the need of the hour. But so when we look at this citizenship proposal that has been put in place, the government is saying that you need to be a citizen of Australia in order to own a firearm. Do you think that this will affect the permanent residents who are currently there and who are licensed gun owners?
Definitely, Shivani, because all those people or the residents, all of them are not citizens. They have a stay, or it could be on the visa or the work permits, but they may not be the citizens, and therefore, definitely, if they are owning the weapons, then they'll have to return the weapons or the firearms. And in case from now on, if you have to possess a firearm, you will have to be a citizen. But I think this is a very tough law because that means that a person who is not a citizen will not be able to own a firearm. Well, this becomes I think, very strict stipulation. Maybe they may have to have a review on this issue because basically, as you rightly brought out, that in Australia to own a gun, self-defense is not one of the criteria. There are other criteria which could be for the reason of sports or for other reasons. So I think this is a very tough law, because that means that if you have to be owning a gun or buy a firearm, you got to be willy-nilly a Australian citizen, and therefore obviously people who today possess firearms, they'll have to surrender or return, because it clearly stipulates that if you're not a citizen, you possibly cannot be owning a firearm, and also in future too, you can't buy a firearm lest you are a citizen of Australia.
Absolutely, I think that's very important for seeing the situation that has currently unfolded in Australia. In fact, also joining us on the broadcast is Andrew Latham, international affairs expert, who's joining us from Minneapolis. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the broadcast. So, when you're looking at this entire new buyback scheme that the Australian government is implementing, it seems very familiar to the 1996 buyback scheme as well. However, it differs in a lot of ways. How are you looking at that scheme or proposal that the Australian government is in fact putting across? And also, do you believe that this buyback is a reset, or do you believe this is a patch for the 3 decades of incremental erosion that has happened in the country?
I think the latter. I think it's about undoing that 3 decades of incremental erosion. Buybacks are partially, the historical record would indicate they're partially successful. A lot of people who are law-abiding will return these weapons. A lot of people who are slightly sketchier, shall we say, might return the weapons, especially if they're going to make a few dollars here and there. But who will not return the weapons are the more hardened criminal class types, at the kind of people that are likely to use the weapons not for hunting, but to commit crimes. And that is what the scheme is really, all of these schemes across the world are really all about, getting guns out of the hands of criminals. And laws like this can only affect that constituency, that population on the margins. Some criminals will steal guns, firearms, from legitimate gun owners, so that prospect gets reduced. But basically, at least it's the case in Canada and the US and elsewhere around the world, and likely in Australia too, as the last 3 decades have indicated, these buyback schemes aren't going to be the decisive answer to the question of gun violence.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll request both my guests to stay on with us as I introduce this piece of information to our viewers, because this is the latest bit of information that's coming in. In Hyderabad, we have the Hyderabad police actually giving out a statement, and they have stated that we have come to know of information that one of the shooters was in fact an Indian, and that's where they had given this information. I'll play out that bite for you in a bit, but let me go across to Major General Dwivedi. Sir, when we are looking at the newer versions, this is also, the Prime Minister has highlighted the problems of 3D printed weapons. He has said that this is of immediate priority. And do you believe that the current criminal codes are sufficient enough to prosecute the possession of digital blueprints, or does this require an entirely new legal framework for ghost guns?
Where you can manufacture the weapons, or you can make the weapons through the 3D. I think this is a altogether different dimension. It is beyond the traditional mechanism or traditional methods of owning a firearm. I think this whole thing will need a review, because today anyone who has the technology, who has the expertise, can actually either manufacture or create a firearm. Well, this is a very, very dangerous situation, because this is where when we say technology is double-edged. So therefore, it could be almost like the home factories or home facilities manufacturing the guns, and this could be very illegal, and this could also mean a huge law and order issue, because once you have the capability to home manufacture the weapons or the firearms, then there's no end to the criminal activities, because they can easily pass off. Today, when the firearms are being acquired through illegal means, then you track the gun running, either there are certain routes through which the guns are either smuggled, or they are gun running, there are certain trails. But here, when people have the capacity to do it at home, I think this requires altogether a very different both legal as also surveillance laws, because this is a very new dimension and goes well beyond the traditional mechanism of possessing a weapon or a firearm. Shivani.
Absolutely. In fact, I believe we do have that bite of the Hyderabad DGP, who's speaking out regarding the connection of one of the shooters to Hyderabad. Let's listen in.
भाई जो सिडनी में जो हादसा हुआ है इसके बारे में, वो तो हैदराबादी से हैदराबाद में बॉर्न हुआ है, वो जन्म हुआ है। वो 1998 से हैदराबाद में नहीं है, तेलंगाना इंडिया में नहीं है। वो 1998 में अपना फर्दर स्टडीज़ के लिए वो ऑस्ट्रेलिया गया है, ऑस्ट्रेलिया जाके वहीं रह रहा है। उसके बाद में वो 2000 में एक बार हैदराबाद आया है अपने बीवी को लेके, 2004 में एक बार आया है, 2009 में एक बार आया है, और 2012 में एक बार आया है, 2016 में एक बार आया है, 2022 में एक बार आया है। ये पूरा जो है ना, इसमें 2-3 मरतबा जो है वो फैमिली डिस्प्यूट्स, फैमिली जो प्रॉपर्टी इश्यूज है उसके बारे में आया है, उसको रिजोल्यूशन करने के लिए आया है। एक बार उनका जो वालिद साहब मर गए थे, उनके पिताजी जो मर गए थे, वो 1 महीने के बाद में वो आए थे। एक मरतबा अपना बीवी को लेकर आए थे, एक बार जो है ना अपना वाइफ एंड अपना मदर और सिस्टर को देखने के लिए आए। भाई
All right, so the Hyderabad DGP over there is dismissing all the concerns. He stated that one of the shooters, he was present in Hyderabad, but after 1998 he has no connection to India. He has visited multiple times, but he has no further connection. All right, let's go back into discussing the proposed gun laws. In fact, if I can go across to Mr. Andrew again. Sir, do you believe that gun laws are an effective tool against ideologically motivated violence? Because here we had a shooter who might have been radicalized. Do you believe that gun laws are the solution, or should we look at something like counter-terrorism strategies rather than weapons regulation?
I think fundamentally this is an issue of culture, political culture. In the United States, for example, the political culture, which is contested, but by and large, the assumption is that you can possess firearms, and then there are restrictions placed on that. But the default setting, the factory setting as it were, is that it's perfectly legitimate under the Second Amendment to possess firearms, period, end of story. There's a variant of that at work in Australia as well. That assumption, that cultural premise, is not the case in the United Kingdom, for example, or in France or Finland or places like that. So culture is number one, and then layered on top of that is the law. And the laws are inadequate. The buyback laws, but gun laws in general, are inadequate in an age of ghost guns because they don't possess serial numbers. And that's the whole point of them. They're easily accessed, but they don't possess serial numbers, so you can't track them, you can't monitor them, you can't surveil them, and you can't regulate them. And that is a fundamental problem. So the gun laws of the 20th century will apply to traditional firearms. They'll still work to the extent that they do work, they'll still work. But they will not help with this deeper problem of ghost guns, these fabricated weapons. That's going to require a cultural shift. That's going to require new laws, and I haven't the faintest idea what they might look like, how you might regulate these in a meaningful way. And it's going to perhaps require a shift from mere law enforcement to a more counterterrorism posture and premise. And that is going to not go down well in a lot of parts of the world, the United States, for example, but even countries like Canada and I won't comment on India. I'll let my co-panelists comment on that angle. But that's going to be a hard sell to not just criminalize firearms, but to anathematize them as as something to do with terrorism.